Ми про діалог. Я вважаю, так, треба припинити хоча б бомбардування людей. Просто бомбардування припинити.
Welcome back to Washington. President Zelensky of Ukraine delivering his own State of his Country address. He addressed the European Union today and talked about just how desperate the situation was there. He's asked for a no-fly zone. He is not going to get one. Just in the past couple of minutes, we understand one of the things President Biden will announce today in the State of the Union, now about an hour and 15 minutes away. President Joe Biden to announce that the United States is closing its airspace to Russian planes. That will happen tonight. With that, we bring in former ambassador to the United Nations, as well as former National Security Advisor John Bolton. Ambassador, good to see you, as always. Have we yet done anything to Vladimir Putin that he has not already baked in to his calculus of invading Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. I think there have been some things that have happened he didn't expect. I don't think he expected the Ukrainian military and civilian militia to put up the fight that they have. I think it's really been quite remarkable, very inspiring, unfortunately doomed to failure ultimately. I think the hardest thing for Vladimir Putin so far has been the failure of his own military. We've got many reports of his trucks and equipment running out of gasoline. Reports today from the Pentagon, they've run out of food. Almost incredible to think this is the descendant of the Soviet military we feared during the Cold War. I think that's about to change. I think the sheer brute force of all the Russian troops and equipment coming across are going to begin to make a difference. And I'm very worried. Much of major Ukrainian cities are about to be reduced to rubble.
Yeah, I think the Russian saying is that quantity has a quality all of its own in terms of just throwing men and equipment at the Ukrainians until the Ukrainians run out of ammunition, which, at least in some ways, in terms of the anti-tank missiles, that may be happening. I wanted to get your thought on this. There is the potential tonight for Vladimir Putin to be watching the State of the Union and seeing the split screen of Kyiv on one side and President Biden talking tough about Vladimir Putin. And with one phone call, he launches a couple of missiles that explode whatever that live shot camera in Kyiv is looking at. What's his calculus on that? And what's the calculus from the White House's side if he does it?
Well, I'll be surprised if he does anything. For one thing, it'll be 5 in the morning in Moscow, and I expect Putin may be asleep. But in any event, I think it's going to be, the risk is it's going to be bombardment all night long, maybe beginning the minute the State of the Union message ends, there in Kharkiv and other areas. You know, the Western media have not given it much coverage, but in the southern part of Ukraine, along the northern shore of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, the Russians have had more success, and there may be more action down there tonight as well.
Mike Allen, who was on earlier, has talked about how there is already this discussion inside the White House and also the national security apparatus in the United States and then with our allies overseas. How to give Vladimir Putin a way out. Sun Tzu would call it the golden bridge. Look over here. You can walk away from this embarrassment, or look over here. It continues. What is the golden bridge?
Well, I tell you, I have an article I'm writing right now. I want to see what the State of the Union message is that I expect will be published in The Hill in the very near future, where I argue it would be a big mistake, a big strategic mistake for the United States and the West to give off-ramps to Putin right now, even to offer off-ramps when we are not in a position of strength to do that. I think is a big mistake. There's a lot of self-congratulation, a lot of patting of backs going on in the U.S. and Europe about how tough we are. Tell that to Ukrainians. They are the ones who are suffering from this military onslaught, and we're explaining to them what a great job they're doing while we look from the tall grass with heavy field glasses.
Yeah, well, it's definitely, there has been a complete lack of commitment in terms of any kinds of U.S. forces. I know you don't often agree with President Biden's foreign policy, but specifically on this issue of a no-fly zone or committing U.S. forces to where you could end up with a force-on-force Russia versus the United States, I feel like you're probably on board with that.
Well, I think there should be a no-fly zone. You could start just in the western part of Ukraine and perhaps expand it from there. But look, if you say, as Biden will tonight, I'll guarantee it, he stands with Ukraine. What he doesn't say are the important qualifiers: at no cost or low cost and no risk. And that's a policy that consigns Ukraine to defeat by Russia. And I think it will have strategic implications for Europe, and I think it will have strategic implications for the U.S. there and in the Indo-Pacific as well. We've got to keep in mind that between Putin in Moscow and Xi Jinping in Beijing, this struggle is not simply about Ukraine. Ukraine is the front line right now, but it's a much broader struggle. Putin has clearly made some miscalculations, but he's still thinking strategically, as is the Chinese leadership, and we are not. And if we don't start thinking about this broader struggle, which is what Putin's big picture aim is, we will continue to be at a disadvantage.
What could the president announce that would change Putin's calculus, that would be the unexpected price to pay for going into Ukraine? Put a different way, if tonight President Biden says this, you'd go, wow, that will get Vladimir Putin's attention.
Well, there are a number of things he could do that he won't do. He will not announce a no-fly zone. He will not announce substantial increases in American weapons. He certainly won't announce American boots on the ground. What I would say that is possible that he could do is he should announce that we are going to bring down Russia's energy sector. We're going to savage it. We're going to bar all exports of Russian oil and gas. We're going to cut off all payments that are due. We're going to freeze all oil and gas-related assets around the world. We're going to drive his revenues to zero. Now, people will say, well, my goodness, that will drive up the price of gasoline. Maybe it will. Do you want to stop the Russian military from grinding Ukraine into the ground, threatening other NATO allies in Europe, and telling the Chinese that America is all talk and no action? We can keep doing what we're doing. We'll do a pretty good job of accomplishing that objective. I don't think that's in America's long-term strategic interest. It's certainly not going to do anything for the Ukrainians.
We really, at this point, we kind of have to wait and see. Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.